Our last speaker in the session is Dr. Charles Wessner, Professor of Global Innovation Policy from Georgetown University, who will address the interrelated challenges that the community of nations face, such as energy, the environment, and productive employment. He will present how some leading countries support manufacturing and the effectiveness of their programs. Dr. Wessner currently teaches at Georgetown, and previously he served for 2 decades as the National Academy Scholar, where he founded and directed the National Academy of Sciences, Technology, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship program. The overarching goal of this work is to develop a better understanding of how to bring new technologies forward to address global challenges in health, climate, energy, water, infrastructure, and security. Dr. Wessner.
Thank you, Dan. And I'm in your debt and that of Bob Kiggins for having the pleasure to talk with you today. It is, like some of the other speakers, it's a bit humbling to talk with people who are generating the next generation of aircraft and the next generation of Nokias, perhaps. But what I'd like to do is talk about some very practical things. What I specialize in is practical policy advice. Now, of course, not everyone loves practical policy advice. They prefer to talk about theory or very long-term objectives. But I think we've agreed here today that we need new companies to bring new technologies to market, to create new jobs and growth. That's the goal. Of course, I'm reminded of a Swedish diplomat's observation about his fellow Swedes. He said they understood the nature of the global economic challenge, and they were willing to do whatever is necessary to address it on the condition that nothing changed. And I think you have a problem here sometimes in Europe, but you have a problem with the C word, and that is change. Everything is acquired, everything is a right, and you need to change. Now, if I seem to be not as convivial as some of your American friends, I'd point out that I've lived and worked a long time in Europe and have come to love the place, but would love to see it do better. So we have this global innovation imperative, and we need to innovate, and we need to collaborate, and I think you've heard that today, but we also need new laws and new institutions if we're going to capitalize on the advantage that these technologies offer us. They're not for free. The competition is intense. You know, I don't think that any of the soccer teams, or what you would call the football teams here in Europe that have lost, are determined not to change. But somehow it seems that the policymakers and the political class know they're losing share, know they're losing ground, know they're sacrificing their children's future, but it's important not to change. And so what I want to talk to you today is a number of things that are changing in the US. Some we've had for some time. And basically, I'm going to talk about tools. We're going to talk about public-private partnerships in early stage finance and in energy and in manufacturing. And you know, one of the unique things about the US these days, no, not just our bad politics, but the fact that we are actually beginning to learn from others. In the US, we have a habit of talking about the global economy, but staying resolutely local when we talk about what needs to be done. We have begun to learn, and I hope that there'll be a mutual process here where we learn. We've agreed in general that small technologies are often key to develop new technologies. But one of the problems is that small companies are small. And in the US, we have a problem. Less so than you have in perhaps Germany, but I think very severe here in Italy, where our companies are home alone. They basically don't have the supportive infrastructure that they need for financing, for demonstrating prototypes, for attracting investors. And that's because often they require facilities and testing equipment, particularly as the new technologies become more complex and more daunting, that they individually can't afford. We've established for some time that you need industrial research consortia. You saw how well the US is doing in the semiconductor industry. In no small part, that is due to a long-established collaboration between both state and federal government, not least when they set up the Semitech Research Consortium years ago when we were in trouble in global competition. One of the underlying challenges that we all face is that the professor, when he comes out of the lab, thinks that he's really solved the problem. He's actually right here at TR1. He's had a very interesting discovery. You know where the money is spent here, don't you? The money is not spent at 1. It's not spent at 2. The big money comes in 6, 7, 8, and 9. And that's where some of the problems are. So we have in the US, I'm sure you don't have this problem here, we have something called the Valley of Death. And what happens in this Valley of Death is that good ideas from good companies perish. They die. And why do they die? Is because they can't get the money to prove. The classic thing is you go to a venture capitalist and you say, we need money for phase 1 trials. And he looks at them and says, that's great. When you finish those trials, come back and talk to me. And they say, no, we need the money to do the trials. He says, I said, when you finish the trials, come back and talk to me. Which raises another point, by the way. Have you ever heard the big European excuse? We don't have enough venture capital. We really don't. Well, let me just put a nail in that. You know, what you need to attract venture capitalists is deal flow. Trust me, if there's enough deal flow, they'll find you. Oh, and by the way, I think it's great that you want venture capital, but I don't think you should do any of the things the venture capitalists need to be here. You don't want the companies purchased. You don't want losses carried forward. You don't want the tax incentives. You don't want the private venture capital. You've come up with public venture capital. Is that really wise? Is that really the problem? No, that's not really the problem. Look at the US. See that little sliver there? That little red piece? That's the seed capital. The venture capitalists in the US are basically trying to get out of the early stage funding business. Why do they want to do that? Why do they want out? Well, because they lose money, that's why they want out. So they want someone else to take that up. And I would suggest that you need to think about that as well. Do you really think you should put lots of venture there? This is where we get our funding. And my point is simply that there's a broad diversity in funding. Venture capital is not the magic bullet in the US. Is it helpful? Yes. Is it a valuable asset? Yes. But it's not the secret sauce. And one of the things we do in the US that we don't talk a lot about because it doesn't really fit with our free market narrative is something called the Small Business Innovation Research Program. We help our small companies, but we don't help small companies because they're small. We help the ones that we think are really good. We have a very competitive program, and we have a phased program. Now I can talk, you said I had 30 minutes to talk about this slide, was it? So I can go through this in some detail. But the broader point is the phasing is absolutely crucial. Why is the phasing important? Because you don't know. You don't know what's going to work. Really promising technologies often fail, or the team that is managing them fails, or the market shifts. It's also a second chance program. You're allowed to take more than one shot. If you have a phase 1 application in and you get that phase and it doesn't work perfectly, you can try again. Does the program work? Yeah, it generates employment. It produces a lot of patents. It solves problems for the government. And one measure of working, if you wonder whether SBR works, look at the cell phone. Please don't read it right now, but in your cell phone, you have Qualcomm chips. Qualcomm employs 26,000 people. It's a $100 billion company, and it's an SBR company that worked. But we leave that out of our narrative because that's embarrassing to say that the government does something that works. In the US, we have begun to understand, we've had a very bad phase of listening to what our economists had to say. And I would very much like to associate with one of our previous speakers that it's economics is often a belief system rather than a science. But one of the problems we found is that although we continue to invent things, we continue to make really nifty, interesting products, we have trouble keeping them on shore. More and more we're finding that things invented here are no longer produced here. Now let me caution you, we're not trying to freeze the global allocation of production. It's neither possible nor desirable. But you know, we would kind of like to produce something. Indeed, I'll talk about energy in a minute, and there's some dangers with our success there. This is all manufactured products in our deficit. And now you'll notice the blue line. We didn't worry about the blue line because we have a principle. If you don't know people that work in this, then it doesn't matter. But we do know the people who work in this. And it has slowly occurred to us that maybe it matters a lot. So what can we do to anchor technologies here? We have another valley of death, this gap here in the production cycles as you go up the technology readiness levels. So this is where we started to learn from others. And I'd just like to draw attention to two programs that we looked at. One is Canada. Now it's very hard for the Americans to remember where Canada is, but if you work at it, you can eventually convince them to look just a little bit to the north. We've been very impressed with this program. I don't mean to suggest that it's perfect. It doesn't have the phasing and awards that it should, and it basically doesn't have the money that it might use. But it does work. It has questions of scale. And we were very impressed to note that the Canadian government just basically doubled their contribution to it. The Americans have begun to talk about German programs. When you look at German commercial success, and particularly their success with their Mittelstand, the question is, what are they doing? Well, one of the things they're doing, aside from working hard, is providing a whole set of support system with over 60 centers across Germany, $2.5 billion, 20,000 employees, scale, longevity, begun in 1949, closely associated with their universities. There's the Fraunhofers are all on universities. The people that direct the Fraunhofers are university professors. Their focus on incremental improvement, the regular training to provide a skilled workforce, absolutely superb facilities, partly maintained by industry by putting in new equipment, and an outstanding brand. This has attracted the attention of the White House in Washington. And so there's a new strategy. We want more innovation. We've recognized that our neglect of the middle skills, what we call community colleges, has become very serious. What's interesting is that there are two groups of industry people. There are those that say we can't find people to hire. The recent MIT study says actually that's not true. It may take you 6 weeks to 2 months, but you can live with that. They say they don't have the right skills. Some complain, some train. Global Foundries in New York, that I'll talk about in a few minutes, has set up a program with the Hudson Valley Community College. It's now being expanded across New York. They're training what they need. They're not waiting for the government to come in and magically solve their problems. They're doing it cooperatively in a public-private partnership. You mentioned energy over and over here, the high cost. Well, we have made a major breakthrough in this, as you may have heard. It's saving each and every one of us money. It's reshoring manufacturing. And we're not meeting, but we're closer than we were by far to the Kyoto targets. We're improving our environment and we're lowering carbon emissions. I was in Ireland and I was informed reliably that Western Pennsylvania was uninhabitable as a result of the destruction resulting from shale gas. Well, I might have believed that, except I live in Western Pennsylvania, and my family's in Western Pennsylvania, and they're doing fine, thank you. The water's better than it used to be. The mines nearly wrecked all the water, but the shale gas really isn't. How did we get here? There's another dirty secret from the Americans. The government helped. A public-private partnership over 3 decades. Most Americans don't know this, and the ones that do don't want to know. But in fact, it's the tax credits that brought the industry down the cost curve and up the learning curve. They solved problem after problem after problem in conjunction with very daring private enterprise. So there's another new initiative that President Obama has launched, the National Network for Manufacturing. It is reflecting what goes on in Fraunhofer, but maybe closer, I think, although we really can't admit this in the US, to the French system, the Carnot Institutes, which are what we call a Fraunhofer light system, where they're using existing universities. I'm looking forward to hearing about the new Italian initiative, but I haven't heard about that yet. I hope I will soon. We have a new additive manufacturing center in Youngstown. It's interesting that the private sector was required to match the federal contribution. The money is not large, it's 30 million, but the private sector put up more than they were required to and plans to put up more. There are a whole series of new institutes in formation. There's one for lightweight materials that has just been announced that's going to be in Detroit. I think you'll hear more about that shortly. There's a new next generation power electronics, help in the semiconductor industry. There's one on digital manufacturing that has just been announced. And what I would stress here, and what's interesting about what we're doing, is it's not just applied research, which is essential, but it's also integrating new technologies, it's integrating small and medium enterprises, it's trying to build out the supply chain and have the capacities that you need. You know, people say that the supply chain has been hollowed out. Well, you know, the Chinese and Koreans have been building supply chains. When we tried to get the textile industry from the British in the 18th century, no one said, we don't have the supply chain. We built it. When Nokia wanted to move into mobile telephones, they didn't say, well, we don't have that supply chain up here. No, they built it. And I think we can do the same. So what you're getting here is the start of a major network working across the US. There are political clouds over it. It's not sure all this will be done. But what's important is that we've come to recognize, both Republicans and Democrats, that we need to do something on manufacturing, that manufacturing does matter, and this is one way of doing it. That's at the federal level. But one of the things that's particularly important to say when we're here in Piedmont, when we're here in Milano, in the industrial heartland, is the importance of regional initiatives. New York is now one of the leading semiconductor producers in the United States. For those of you who don't know, New York is not in California. New York in Albany. Now, I don't know whether you know anything about Albany, and I would have argued a few years ago there was nothing to know. But sustained state leadership, close cooperation by IBM with the State University of New York, a focus on new institutions, the College of Nanoscale Sciences. They wanted the Semitech Consortium that I mentioned earlier, but it was in Austin. So they basically went down there and said, why don't you move up here? How much would it take? And they provided the money to bring Semitech up into this cluster. These are some of the key developments. Just look at the investments. Look at the sustainability. Look that it was on both parties, Democrats and Republicans in New York, who recognized this was something to do. And you know that wonderful Chinese quote? You know, overnight success usually reflects 10 years of hard effort. And that's what they've done in New York. The payoffs have been enormous in terms of new jobs, building out the supply chain. Global Foundries has just announced another $3 billion investment in expanding the foundries. So, in conclusion, and Dan, you know, John Kenneth Galbraith always said that halfway through your talk you should say in conclusion, just to give your audience hope. It was... So if we're going to survive in today's economy, it is a global economy. And if we're going to survive, then things do have to change. We need to work on that workforce. We need to expand the university connections to the regional economy. We need to create 21st century universities that I'd love to talk to you about, but are another topic. But they have to reach out. The professors and students have to collaborate with industry, and industry with the universities. We need to share facilities, we need to do the work training, and we need to provide incentives. You know, one of the things that is important is don't have the rector stand up and speak about cooperating with a university. What are the faculty career incentives to do that? What are the financial inducements? You know, professors are dedicated people, but they also have cars and mortgages. So what do we do to make this work better? And we also need to make sure that we are measuring what we're doing. How would you know if you succeeded? The classic question. And only too often, these public programs are assessed after the fact. You need clear metrics. You need people to be watching where you're going and monitoring in regular time. No company would ever launch a major program and not track it. And an important point is the resources need to be significant and sustained. You've got to have critical mass to build out something that can actually matter, and metrics to measure it. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to any questions you may have.